Hi everyone, my name is Mario. I'm an RPG designer. I've been in the games industry for about 15 years and I've worked on some pretty good games, I think, like EverQuest 2, Star Wars Galaxies, and in that time I was a big fan of Japanese RPGs. So I played a lot of Final Fantasy, Miramusa, Odin Sphere, and that's what's led me to eventually become the CEO of Kabojo and to launch our first Western Japanese RPG, Zodiac Orcanon Odyssey. When we first conceived the Zodiac project, it was kind of an amalgamation of a few different things. The first was we had a very passionate game director who had lived in Japan and was very familiar with RPGs, as well as a large group of RPG designers internally. I think the second and probably most interesting thing was that we were in France. And being in France, I hadn't realized as an American that there was a lot of understanding and love for manga culture, as well as the fact that we had a full team of 2D concept artists that worked on all of the games internally and hand drew and hand animated everything. So the first time I met Sakimoto-san, it was quite a surprise. I was returning from a business trip and actually some folks in our studio, the game director, had gone and attended a concert in Paris where Sakimoto-san had performed and asked him to join us at the studio. And it was quite amazing because I had literally just gotten off the plane when I got the phone call at 9:30 in the morning, hey, Sakimoto-san is going to be in the studio in 30 minutes. So of course we rushed, sent an email to the whole company, everybody went home and got their Final Fantasy XII and Tactics discs, and then returned to the studio, and there he was. So for the first time, of course, me meeting one of the great legendary composers from the Final Fantasy series, and he was a super nice guy, very down to earth, very respectful, and I knew it was going to be great to work with him if we got a chance. When it comes to RPGs in France, I think it's quite unique, and I was surprised because I've only lived in France now for 3 or 4 years. But what's interesting to me is that I didn't realize that Japanese anime and manga was, that France was the #2 consumer worldwide in these types of media, ahead of the US, ahead of the rest of Europe. And so when you grow up and you read Japanese culture and you watch Japanese movies, I think it imparts a special sort of cultural knowledge of what those stories are, how stories are told in Japan, how people play games even in Japan. And because of that, France is one of the first countries that gets Japanese RPGs imported to it. So I think there is sort of a natural closeness between Japan and France that most people in the world don't know about. So the scenario for Zodiac, I would say, is quite unique. When we first spoke to Nojima-san about the scenario, he typically writes for teenagers, and Zodiac was intended to be much more of an adult story. So the characters are not teenagers in Zodiac, they're adults. And the world that I would say Zodiac is set in is much closer to Final Fantasy XII than any of the other, I guess, games. And what we would say is we have the game about 50 to 60% sci-fi and 30 to 40% fantasy, high fantasy. The reason to go more science fiction with the story than high fantasy was because we wanted it to have a Western touch. And I think when you go too deep into fantasy, especially Japanese fantasy, it gets very Eastern very quickly. So our goal was in creating a game where we had adult characters that had more serious themes like Game of Thrones, that the story would be a bit more interesting for adult players that had played Final Fantasy maybe 15 or 20 years ago but had evolved and kind of moved on. The music is, I think, phenomenal for me. It's one of the coolest things I've ever done in video game development. Working with Sakimoto, having him work with orchestras and whatnot in Tokyo, having him concept everything. So the first main theme he created basically with very little direction from us, and it was almost perfect. We told him basically that we wanted a game that had some of the sensibilities of Final Fantasy but was a bit more sci-fi. I think Sakimoto-san is really known for creating these epic kind of soundtracks, and for the continual creation of music, it's very interesting because I think he feeds off of that first main theme, and what's cool is we supply him something like a new level or something, he plays it, and then he comes up with a theme. So I think this exchange we have with him for the creation of music has been very good. I'm very pleased with what he's done. Animation and 2D graphics is kind of a lost art. We like to think of ourselves as Disney in a way in the 1950s. So when people talk to us about what are we shooting for in terms of quality of the game, our game director actually and I discussed it, and we were definitely shooting for The Lion King. You know, just a year after The Lion King, Toy Story 1 was released, which is also a Pixar Disney movie. And if you look at the differences between those movies, you know, 10, 15, 20 years later, you can see how the hand-drawn, hand-animated style of The Lion King really holds up. And that's the goal for Zodiac. That was what we set as the artistic goal. We want a game that 10, 15, 20 years from now people will look at and still judge as beautiful, which is why we decided to focus on 2D. So we had to work with Unity and create some of our own tools and also work with the guys at Spine for the animation. And that's turned out very, very well for us. For me, I think the reason to create and also to play Zodiac is I haven't had that feeling probably for about 10 or 15 years since playing a Final Fantasy game, that I really was drawn into a world with these deep characters in a story and an experience that I would remember as long and as deeply as I have since, like I said, Final Fantasy 6 or 7. I think that's missing in the newer series as we get more into 3D, you know, changing combat. The story and kind of the simplicity of what Final Fantasy was, I think, is kind of lost. And so that's what we wanted to recapture, which is why we went to Mr. Nojima-san, we went to Sakimoto-san, we went to many people in the Japanese industry. And I think games like this are not made anymore, to be honest. So if you want that chance to kind of step back 10 or 15 years into the past and re-experience what you experienced, then I think Zodiac really does offer that opportunity. I guess the main message I wanted to give the world and the gaming community about Zodiac is that it's definitely a risky passion project from an independent group of developers that are trying to recapture what we believe video game players loved for many years and have not had. Because of the changes in the industry, the big budgets, you know, the shift in platforms and whatnot, games like Zodiac, I think just are not made anymore. And even in Japan, we get quite a warm reception for it. So my message, I think, to everyone is that I hope they greatly enjoy the game. We've made all the changes that I think people have suggested to us through the community. And this year when the game launches, I hope they really enjoy playing through the story of Zodiac, an original Nojima-san story, separate from the Final Fantasy universe, with the first-time collaboration between Western and Eastern game designers to create a truly global IP.